The night of the midsummer ball, Rosalind Vane knelt in the wet grass of the East Garden with her hands pressed against a man's ribs. And she did not think about the dare he had issued 4 hours earlier, or about the silk-clad women who had laughed at it, or about the fact that she had not been among those invited to accept it. She thought about the angle of the wound beneath his torn coat, about the particular stillness of a man who had been bleeding quietly for longer than anyone knew, and about whether the kitchen passage was unlocked at this hour, or whether she would have to break a pane to reach the linen press inside. She had not come to Ashford Park to be noticed. She had come because Mrs. Aldwell, the widow of a Hertfordshire solicitor and a woman with chronically weak ankles, had required a companion for the summer's social engagements, and because the position paid £6 a quarter, and because £6 a quarter was the difference between her brother Silas receiving his lodgings at the Dry Air Sanatorium in Richmond and being turned out of them. The £400 their father had borrowed against the house had not gone away when he died. It had simply transferred its weight to Rosalind's shoulders, and she had been carrying it for 2 years without letting the posture show. She was 23 years old. She had a plain white muslin gown retrimmed with ribbon that did not quite match, and she wore it with the same steadiness she brought to everything, because there was nothing else to be done about it. The ball had been glittering and enormous, as the entertainments at Ashford Park always were when the Earl of Westhall opened his house to the county in summer. 60 candles burned in every chandelier. The flowers were white roses and hothouse gardenias, and the scent of them moved through the room in warm waves whenever the terrace doors opened. The orchestra was the one from London, the same one the Earl had engaged the previous 2 summers, and it played with a precision that made the dancing look less like pleasure and more like a very elegant military exercise. Rosalind had sat with Mrs. Aldwell near the second window, pouring her lemonade and keeping her shawl from slipping and retrieving her dropped fan twice in the first hour. This was the work. She was accustomed to it, and she did not resent it. And if her eyes occasionally moved across the room to the place where Lord Edmund Ashford stood in conversation with the county's most consequential men, she allowed herself that small freedom without attaching any meaning to it. He was 31, and recently come into the title after his father's death the previous autumn. He was tall in the way of men who have never questioned whether the room would accommodate them, and his face had the controlled quality of someone who had decided long ago that expression was a form of currency he preferred not to spend in public. He wore black and white with an austerity that looked almost like mourning in the candlelight, though the season for mourning his father had formally ended in April. Several women in diamonds watched him from various points around the room. He appeared to have noticed none of them. The dare had been issued at 9 o'clock. Rosalind had not heard it directly. She had heard it the way one hears most things at a ball, when one is positioned near the window in a retrimmed muslin, through the particular pitch that spreads through a room when something has been said that everyone will remember. The story reached her in fragments, carried by Mrs. Aldwell's neighbor on the left, a pink-faced woman named Mrs. Carell, who had watched the whole thing with the satisfied attention of someone who had come precisely for this. Lord Westhall had addressed 6 assembled young women in the East drawing-room before supper, where they had gathered with the deliberate display of women who have been advised by their mothers to look available without appearing to seek. He had looked at each of them in turn and said, in the level voice that apparently required no raising to carry across a room, that he would make his selection at the conclusion of the season, that he had this summer and no other to devote to the matter, and that if any of them wished to recommend herself to his attention, they had one night in which to make whatever impression they intended. "You have one night to impress me," was the specific wording, according to Mrs. Carell. Miss Dorinda Cale, who stood closest to him and whose diamonds were real, and whose mother was the daughter of a baronet, had smiled as though she had already won. Rosalind had said nothing when Mrs. Aldwell relayed this with a significant look. She had poured more lemonade and returned the shawl to its correct position and considered the subject closed. Then, at 9:10, Edmund Ashford had crossed the length of the ballroom on some errand toward the terrace, and his gaze had passed over the room in the way a man's gaze passes over furniture, and for one instant it had stopped. Not on Dorinda Cale. Not on the 6 assembled women still glittering in the east drawing-room doorway. On Rosalind, who was sitting with a shawl in her hands near the second window, unremarkable in every particular, and who looked away first. She did not examine this. She stored it where she stored all such things, in a place that required no attention, and she returned to her work. The event that changed everything did not arrive as drama. It arrived as a sound, just past midnight, when the ball had thinned, and the older guests had retired, and the orchestra was playing its last slow set. Rosalind had stepped outside for 10 minutes of cool air because Mrs. Aldwell had fallen asleep in her chair with the contented heaviness of a woman who had eaten 2 suppers, and because the gardenias had grown oppressive, and Rosalind's head had begun to ache behind her eyes. The east garden was dark beyond the first line of lanterns. The path ran down beside the box hedge, and there was a stone bench at the turn, and on the bench was a shape that did not belong there, folded in the particular collapse of a man who has been standing through the force of his will alone, and has finally, in the dark and the quiet, run out of will. She reached him before she had decided to. He was conscious. That was the first thing she assessed, the way she had learned to assess her brother's condition on waking each morning, with the specific swift reading of a person who has understood for a long time that the difference between a crisis and a manageable difficulty is often measured in minutes. His breathing was shallow and fast, and his left hand was pressed to his side beneath his coat. And when she crouched beside him and said, with no preamble, "Where and how long?" his jaw tightened as though she had said something offensive. "My lord," she added, because it mattered even here. "A riding injury," he said, "this afternoon. You have been standing and dancing and receiving guests with a riding injury since this afternoon." It was not a question. The tightening of his jaw confirmed it. "The household," she said. "No." She understood. A house full of guests, a season already bought and planned, an earl who had inherited 12 months ago and was still proving to the county that his tenure was stable and serious and unshakable. Scandal spread from smaller beginnings. She did not argue. She said, "I will need the linen press inside the kitchen passage. I will need a candle, water, and if there is willow bark preparation in the still room, that as well. Can you walk as far as the passage door with my support?" He looked at her then in the way he had looked at her across the ballroom, the same arrested quality, as though she had said something that required recalibration. "You are Mrs. Aldwell's companion," he said. "Yes." "You have medical training." "No. I have a brother with consumption, and a mother who died slowly over 4 years, and I have read everything in print on the subject of nursing the ill because there was no one else to do it." She straightened and offered her arm. "We should move before anyone comes through from the terrace." He stood. The effort it cost him was visible in the lines of his face, though he did not make a sound. She steadied him with both hands at his left side, and he was warm through his coat and very solid, and she kept her attention on the path and the door and the practical sequence of what needed to be done next. The wound was a deep graze from a fence post, she determined, once she had him inside the kitchen passage with the candle lit and his coat off and his waistcoat opened. He had strapped it himself, badly, with a strip torn from his shirt, and the binding had held the bleeding to a slow seep rather than a flood. which was why he had managed 8 hours upright before his body decided it had had enough. The skin around it was hot and beginning to show the first warning colors. She unwound the old binding, cleaned the wound with water boiled on the kitchen fire, rebound it properly with strips from the linen press folded in the double-layer method she had learned from a surgeon's manual her father had kept on the lower shelf, and told him what she was doing at each step with the steady, quiet practicality of someone who had done this in rooms where the stakes were higher. He watched her the whole time. She was accustomed to being watched with a kind of management, the way one watches a useful implement. But this was different, and she did not examine the difference. "The willow bark preparation," she said when she had finished, and he said which cupboard without her asking. She found it, and measured 2 spoonfuls into water, and handed it to him, and waited while he drank it with the expression of a man who has decided that dignity is a luxury he cannot presently afford, and found the decision uncomfortable. "You should sit until the shivering stops," she said. "Then I will help you to your room through the back passage." "The guests?" "The last carriages left 20 minutes ago. The household is asleep. There is no one to see." He studied her across the candle. "Why?" he said, and left the word without a completion, which was itself a kind of completion. She understood the question. She answered it honestly, because she was too tired by then for careful performance. "Because you were injured and needed assistance. There was no other reason." She had thought, when she gave that answer, that it settled the matter. She had not anticipated Thomas. The boy appeared in the doorway of the kitchen passage at 2:30 in the morning, 6 years old and wearing a nightshirt and holding a toy soldier by one leg, his eyes red-rimmed with the sleeplessness of someone who has been frightened for hours. He stood in the doorway looking at his guardian, who was sitting in a kitchen chair with his coat off and his face drawn white, and then he looked at Rosalind, and his lower lip began to tremble. She went to him immediately. She sat on the cold stone floor so that she was level with him, and she said softly that his guardian had hurt his hand, which was the version of the truth a 6-year-old could carry, and that it had been bandaged and would be better in the morning, and that she would sit with him until he was ready to go back to bed. She did not say that everything was fine, because she had learned from experience that children heard the falseness of that phrase and were made more afraid by it. She said what was true. "He is here. I am here. The house is quiet, and you are not alone." Thomas pressed himself against her shoulder, his toy soldier clutched in both hands, and she put her arm around him and talked quietly about nothing much, about the garden, about the horses she had seen in the stable yard that morning, about whether the roses would still be blooming in September, until the tension in his small body eased and his breathing steadied and his eyes began to close. She did not look up. She had not heard Edmund move. But when she finally raised her eyes, he was watching from across the kitchen with an expression she could not name. Because it was the first unguarded thing she had seen on his face, and it was so raw and still and unlike anything she had expected from him that she looked away quickly, the way one looks away from something that is not meant to be seen. He did not speak. He simply sat there in the candlelight with his coat off and his bandaged side and his face open, watching his ward sleep against the shoulder of a woman he had only looked at once across a ballroom. And Rosalind held the sleeping child and pretended she had seen nothing. Dawn came gray and cool through the kitchen window. Thomas had been carried back to his room by Edmund, moving with care, but moving steadily, the willow bark having done its work. Rosalind had rinsed her hands in the kitchen basin and tidied the passage and put the linen scraps in the fire, and she was gathering the last of it when Edmund returned. He stood in the doorway, coat back on, imperfectly fastened, and said, "Sit down." She sat. He poured water and put it in front of her with the same brevity he gave to most things, and then he sat across from her, and was quiet for a moment in the particular way he had, which she was learning was not coldness, though it resembled coldness in bad light. "Thomas does not sleep easily," he said at last. "I noticed. He has not since his mother died." His eyes moved to the window. "She died the week after he was born. I was at the North Estate. There had been a drainage problem on 12 acres that I judged could not wait, and I had been there 4 days. And by the time the express arrived, I was too late by 6 hours." The words came out level, without inflection, as though he had said them to himself so many times that they no longer required a voice. "He does not sleep easily, and he does not take readily to people, and you sat on the floor with him for 40 minutes. Rosalind did not say that it had been no trouble, because it had not been no trouble, and she suspected he would know that, and she did not want to offer him a false coin. She said, "He is a good boy." Edmund looked back from the window. Something in his face was still open in the way it had been when she first looked up, and he had not yet recovered the controlled surface completely. And she was aware, in the growing light, of the particular quality of sitting alone with someone when all the social architecture has fallen away, and there is nothing left but what is actually true. "Why are you in service?" he said. It was not quite a question, and not quite an accusation, and she was not certain which it was meant to be. "My father left a debt of £400. My brother has consumption. A paid position was the available solution." He looked at her for another moment with the arrested quality she could not name. Then the surface came back, quiet and careful, and he said, "Thank you, Miss Vane." And it was formal, and it was true, and it was the end of the conversation. She went back to Mrs. Aldwell's room, changed her gown, and appeared at breakfast at 8 o'clock. Lady Philippa Ashford was already at the table. Rosalind had seen Edmund's mother at a distance during the ball, a tall woman of 60, with the posture of someone who had been told since girlhood that her carriage was her best feature and had taken the advice permanently. She wore dove gray over a darker gray pelisse, and her jewelry was seed pearls and jet, which was period-appropriate and precise, and slightly threatening in the way of things that are exactly correct. She sat at the head of the breakfast table with the kind of settled authority that does not require announcement. She waited until the footman had finished serving, and the 12 remaining houseguests were settled with their plates before she spoke. "I understand," she said, to no one in particular, and therefore to everyone, that Mrs. Aldwell's companion remained below stairs until past dawn. The table went still in the way tables go still when a countess uses a particular tone. A young woman of good sense does not wander a gentleman's house at night unaccompanied. Lady Philippa lifted her cup. Unless, of course, her intentions are not those of a person of good sense. Rosalind set down her fork. Across the table, Dorinda Cale's eyes moved to Rosalind with the swift, assessing pleasure of someone who has just been handed an advantage she had not expected. "I would not say intentions of that kind," said Mrs. Correll, who appeared to be a woman for whom no social tension was ever quite enough. "I would say a young woman with nothing to recommend her, and every reason to seek a patron would take whatever opportunity presented itself." There was a soft collective exhalation around the table, the sound of 12 people deciding whether to agree or to wait and see. Rosalind picked up her fork again. "I assisted with a household matter during the night," she said steadily, to her plate and to no one. There was nothing more to it. "A household matter," Lady Philippa repeated, with the faint emphasis of someone who has found the precise word to apply pressure to. "How useful you are, Miss Vane. How very convenient that usefulness should coincide with an evening on which my son has publicly announced his intention to select a wife." This was the name for it then. Fortune hunter. It was not the first time Rosalind had heard it applied to a woman who had nothing, She had heard it at her father's funeral, when two of his creditors had looked at her across the churchyard with the cool assessment of men calculating her marriage value against her father's outstanding accounts. She had heard it in the voice of Mrs. Aldwell's neighbor in Bath, who had told Mrs. Aldwell that paying a companion was an extravagance that only encouraged a certain class of girl to think above herself. She heard it now in Lady Philippa's measured drawing-room voice, and she felt it the way she always felt it, as a specific weight placed precisely on the place that already ached. She did not respond. She had nothing to say that would help her, and she knew it. And she finished her breakfast and excused herself with a correctness that Lady Philippa could not fault. She did not see Edmund that morning. He had presumably been tended by his valet, and was presumably in the state his mother expected him to be in, presenting the appropriate surface to his remaining guests. She packed her trunk in the afternoon, because it was clear to her that her position at Ashford Park was no longer tenable, and Mrs. Aldwell, who had been gently managed by Lady Philippa over the morning calls, told her with the apologetic softness of a woman who understands she is being managed, but cannot quite stop it, that it might be best if they departed after the noon meal. Rosalind said that was entirely sensible. She said it to the window of her small room at the back of the east wing, which looked out over the kitchen garden and the path she had walked in the dark, and she said it to herself 3 times, until it settled into something she could carry without breaking. Edmund did not come to the front steps when the carriage was brought round. Mrs. Aldwell's footman loaded the trunk. The gravel was bright in the afternoon sun. Rosalind climbed in and did not look back at the house, because there was nothing behind her that she had any reason to look at. She had not expected to be chosen. She had only, for a few hours in a candle-lit kitchen with a sleeping child against her shoulder, forgotten to remember that. This, if you have found your way to this story, is the moment to stay. Because what looked like the end was not quite where the ending lived. Leave a word in the comments if you have ever remained in a moment past the point of wisdom, and then we will go back to what happened next. Silas was improved in September. The dry air of the Richmond sanatorium had done what it was supposed to do, slowly, over the summer months. And when Rosalind visited him in the first week of October, she found him sitting up and reading and arguing cheerfully with the physician about the nutritional value of beef broth, which she took as a reliable sign of recovery. He was 20 years old and thin, and had their father's dark eyes and a cough that was quieter than it had been in March, and he held her hand for a moment when she sat beside him and said, "The 400 pounds is managed," she said. "How?" "By the same method I have managed everything for 2 years. Do not ask me the particulars." He looked at her with the particular expression of a younger brother who is not entirely reassured and knows better than to push. She changed the subject to the weather and the reading list, and whether his fellow patients were tolerable company, and she went back to her lodgings in Richmond in the evening and sat with her hands in her lap and thought, for the first time in weeks, about the east garden and the kitchen passage and the way the dawn light had looked on the stone flags and the expression on Edmund's face when he watched Thomas sleep. She had not been contacted by Ashford Park. She had not expected to be. She was employed again, this time by a Miss Fairfax of Kensington, an elderly woman who collected porcelain and required assistance at exhibitions, and the work was quiet and orderly, and paid slightly more than Mrs. Aldwell's £6. Rosalind told herself this was enough. She said it with conviction most days. Lady Harwick's autumn ball was not the sort of engagement that Mrs. Vane's daughter, in her current position, would ordinarily have attended. It was Miss Fairfax who required attendance at it, for reasons having to do with a particular Sèvres piece she believed Lady Harwick's drawing-room contained, and which she wished to examine. Rosalind dressed in her dark blue wool, which was the best thing she had, and arranged Miss Fairfax's shawl and her own hair with equal care, and arrived at Harwick House on a night in late October when the air was cold enough that her breath was visible in the carriage doorway. The rooms were full. She recognized the county faces from the summer, the social machinery in its autumn configuration, the same diamonds on different necks, the same orchestra in a different key. Dorinda Cale was there in pale gold silk, her hair dressed with seed pearls, her expression carrying the serene confidence of a woman who has been told all her life that she is the correct answer, and has no reason yet to doubt it. She stood with Lady Philippa near the fireplace, which seemed to Rosalind a very efficient arrangement of forces. Rosalind settled Miss Fairfax near the Sevres cabinet, found her a glass of negus, and stood at the appropriate distance behind her, and looked at nothing in particular. He was there. She knew it before she saw him. In the same wordless way she had known things all summer that she was not supposed to know. And she did not look for him, and she kept her eyes on the porcelain and Miss Fairfax's discussion with Lady Harwick's companion about the glaze technique on the covered tureen. 40 minutes passed. The orchestra changed to a slower piece. The room shifted into its late configuration, couples drifting toward the floor, the older guests settling into chairs, the social topography reorganizing around the music. She heard the shift in the room before she saw what caused it. It was a sound, or rather the absence of one, a sudden drop in the ambient conversation that moved across the room from the east side like weather. The way a room goes quiet when its most powerful inhabitant does something unexpected. She turned, not because she was looking for him, but because the body responds to social weather without asking permission. Edmund Ashford was crossing the floor, not toward the fireplace where his mother stood, not toward Dorinda Cale in her pale gold silk, not toward the senior peers arranged near the doorway who would have been the reasonable destination for a man in his position. He was crossing directly and without ambiguity toward the place where Rosalind stood beside Miss Fairfax's chair, with his hands at his sides and his face wearing the particular expression she had last seen in a kitchen at dawn, which was not quite the controlled surface and not quite the open thing either, but something in between, something she had no vocabulary for. The room was watching. She was aware of it the way one is aware of a fire's heat at a distance, the collective attention of 100 people turning on a single point, and that point was her, standing in dark blue wool with her hands at her sides and her heart audible in her own throat. He stopped 2 feet from her. "Miss Vane?" he said. "My lord." Her voice was steady. She did not know how. He reached into his coat pocket and held out a folded paper, sealed with a solicitor's mark she recognized as belonging to Messrs. Holt and Fenwick of Gray's Inn, who were the firm that had written to her twice regarding her father's outstanding accounts. She took it. Her fingers were cold and his were warm, and the exchange was brief, but she felt it. "The £400 is discharged," he said. "Holt and Fenwick have the documentation. Your brother's arrangements at Richmond are secure through the end of next year, at which point his physician expects the treatment to be complete." He paused, and then he said, "This is not a bid. I want you to understand that clearly before I say what follows." She waited. The room was very quiet. "I have been looking for you since August," he said. "I did not handle the morning after the ball correctly. I know what my mother said at breakfast. I know what it cost you. I am asking you now, in front of every person in this room who was present at Ashford Park this summer, whether you will give me the chance to do this better." It was not a speech. It was exactly 6 sentences. It had the quality of something that had been prepared and then stripped back to its essential bones, and what remained was only what was true. Lady Philippa stood near the fireplace with her fan held at the measured height Rosalind had noted all summer, and for one moment her composure held, and then, in the single short clause of a woman who has understood too late that her script has run past the end of its usefulness. The fan lowered. Dorinda Cale's expression shifted. The serene confidence was still there in the architecture of her face. But underneath it, something else had arrived. Something like the recognition that a thing she had been promised had been quietly given to someone else. And the world had not corrected the error. The room had gone completely still. Rosalind looked at the solicitor's note in her hands. She thought of Silas arguing about beef broth. She thought of Thomas pressed against her shoulder with his toy soldier and his red-rimmed eyes. She thought of a candle-lit kitchen and a man who had told her something he did not say aloud, and the expression on his face, which she had looked away from because she had believed it was not meant for her. She raised her eyes. "You said," she told him, carefully and precisely, "that you had one night to be impressed." "Yes. I was not attempting to impress you." "I know," he said. And there was something in his voice that was almost the thing she had seen in his face in the kitchen, the open, unguarded thing. That was the entire point. He offered his hand. Not for a dance. Simply offered it, in the plain and procedural way of a man asking a question he already knows will take considerable time to answer properly. But who has decided to begin? She took it. The room exhaled. Lady Philippa did not speak. She crossed the room, after a moment. With the deliberate composure of a woman who knows she has been displaced and intends to be displaced gracefully. And if there was something in the line of her back that was chastened, it was a quiet chastening, the kind that arrives without noise. She nodded once to Rosalind as she passed. A single small acknowledgement that was not quite an apology and not quite anything else, and it was more than Rosalind had expected. Miss Fairfax examined the Sèvres tureen with great satisfaction and commented to her companion that the evening had been unexpectedly eventful. The solicitor's note held not only the discharge of the £400, but a separate letter in Edmund's own hand, 3 sentences long, which Rosalind read in the carriage going home while Miss Fairfax dozed under her shawl. It said that he was aware the circumstances were abrupt and that she owed him nothing, that Thomas had asked about her twice in September, and that Ashford Park was a different house with her not in it. The 3rd sentence she read twice. Then she folded it and held it in her lap for the rest of the drive, and said nothing, and watched the October dark outside the window with an expression that Miss Fairfax, had she been awake, would have found difficult to classify. Rosalind Vane became the Countess of Westhall on the 14th day of November in the small church at the edge of the Ashford Park estate, in a ceremony that was attended by Silas, who had been permitted to travel by his physician for a single day, and who wore his father's old coat, and shook Edmund's hand with the grave formality of a young man determined to represent his family correctly. Mrs. Aldwell sent flowers and an apologetic note. Miss Fairfax sent the Sèvres tureen. The first snow of the year came 10 days later. Rosalind stood at the window of the east sitting room, which was her room now, or which was becoming her room in the slow accumulation of small things. A book left on the window seat, a pair of gloves on the side table. The kind of habitation that happens when one stops feeling the need to remain portable. The snow was coming down in the particular soft way of the first snow, without urgency, as though it had all the time in the world. Thomas was at the window too, pressed against the glass with both hands flat on it, and his breath fogging the pane, watching the garden go white. "It will be deep enough for boots tomorrow," she said. He turned and looked at her with the considering expression he wore when he was deciding whether to trust a statement. Then he nodded, satisfied, and turned back to the snow. Edmund came in behind her, and she heard him, rather than saw him, the particular sound of his step. He stood at her shoulder and looked out at the garden, and she was aware of his warmth and the steadiness of him. And after a moment his hand found hers, which was warm from the fire, and he held it the way he held most things, carefully, without excess, as though the thing were worth the care. Thomas pressed his nose to the glass. Rosalind did not look at Edmund. She looked at the garden, and the snow, and the path that ran down beside the box hedge toward the east garden, which was white and quiet, and entirely changed. And she held the hand that had been offered to her in a crowded room by a man who had looked at her across a ballroom 8 months ago, and been unable, it seemed, to entirely look away. In his coat pocket, folded and worn at the crease from 2 years of carrying, his first wife's last letter rested still. It had lived there through the grief and the duty and the long, careful business of going on. It was there now, in this room, with the snow coming down and the boy's breath on the glass and the fire at their backs. He had not put it away, and he had not unfolded it again in months, and it seemed to Rosalind, though she did not say this, and would not have said it, that it had stopped being carried in fear and begun to be carried the way one carries something that has earned its rest. The snow kept falling. She was home. If Rosalind's story has stayed with you, leave a word in the comments about the moment that held you longest. Every story told here is told for you, and your company in it means more than you know.